it's getting beyond a point of being able to function as an analyst here, because these guys simply don't play by the rules of the game. And again, we don't know for sure it's Eldridge Colby, so we don't know who this official is. But all I can tell you is that the Trump folks break the rules of the game, which is when you deal with allies, you do not deal with allies consistently by bullying and threats. At some point, you have to have a relationship where you're working together. That's just not part of Donald Trump's playbook. And I'm afraid that there are those around him who have a little bit more knowledge than Donald Trump, who also function the same way.
Hi, I'm Jo Crawford and welcome to Times Radio's Trump Report. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and you can listen to the Trump Report wherever you get your podcasts from. Today, I'm joined by Scott Lucas, Professor of US Politics at the University College Dublin's Clinton Institute and also founder and editor of EA Worldview. Thank you for joining me on the Trump Report today.
Joe, it's great to be here. Thank you.
So we've heard that the Pentagon has ordered a review into the Aukus pact. It's believed that the Trump administration is potentially threatening to scrap the submarine deal. A US defense official said the Pentagon will be taking an America First approach to this review and that allies will need to step up. What do you make of this?
It certainly has sent a flutter across Australia and across the UK, because this, as a reminder, was this high-profile deal for Australia to get nuclear submarines from the US, the UK, rather than potentially going ahead with France, which had provided submarines to Australia. And those people with long enough memories will remember that the French were none too happy about this, right? But, you know, the Americans pressed ahead at that point. Now, the reason why this has caused a flutter is not necessarily that you have a military review of your agreements. You know, that's natural. How many submarines are we talking about here? Where do they fit into the defense of Australia and the Pacific? That's one. The trigger was this unnamed official, and that it's unnamed, going to the media and saying, part of our America First approach. Because America First, it's not just code, it's out there. And that is, our primary interest is in the US. It's not in Australia. It's not in the Pacific. It's whatever we decide is best for the United States. And with the Trump administration, assuming this is a Trump official rather than a career Pentagon official, with the Trump administration, that means what is good for Donald Trump. Now, the Australians are playing down the statement this morning. Scott Morrison, who was involved in negotiating this, the former prime minister, current officials are saying, look, you have periodic reviews. They're kind of ignoring that trigger of the America First. And this is kind of like, we just have to wait and see, because the wider point here, Joe, is not that I can tell you that they will maintain the agreement or not maintain the agreement. It's the unpredictability that's coming out here. It's the insecurity about security. Because if you're an Australian military official, if you're an Australian politician, now you've got this sort of Donald's Damocles hanging over you, which is, if I don't like what you're doing, I'm going to drop it. And Australia and the US have risks in recent months. The Australians are not happy with Trump's grab bag of economically illiterate tariffs. They're not happy with the idea of an American isolationism that's floated by some Trump people. And you know, all it takes is for Trump on a Friday night when he's feeling a bit down and a bit lonely to say, well, that's it. I'm going to pull out of this agreement. And then where do you go next?
And this is potentially going to put a big question mark over plans that were announced by Keir Starmer last week that the UK would be building around a dozen new submarines expected in the late 2030s. On the other hand, we've got the Times reporting that there is optimism in Whitehall that this Aukus deal could be salvaged, as we saw Starmer secured that trade deal with the US to remove tariffs. And we've got that special relationship there still holding strong between Trump and Starmer. What do you make of this?
Well, first of all, the UK statements today are the same thing the Aussies are doing. And that is, look, why build this up as a crisis? You know, if it's going to be built up into a crisis by the Trump folks, then you have to respond. But until then, treat this as one unnamed official who's trying to cause a bit of, well, uncertainty for reasons that you don't know. right? Now, in terms of the wider context, which is the U.S. Now, in part, this is flatter Trump, flatter Trump, flatter Trump. And it was just that the timing of this strategic defense review by the UK happened to coincide with Pistol Pete Hegseth, the defense secretary and former, TV commentator, coming over to Europe and saying, you better increase your defense spending to 5%. You better increase it, or else we'll think you're unreliable, even though the United States does not spend 5% of its budget, of its GDP, I should say, on defense. And so the UK could say, look at us, look, we're spending it. But here's the wider significance. Those UK submarines are not just there to try to be part of a special relationship with the United States. They are part of a defense that might have to proceed with, whisper it quietly because of the Brexiteers, with Europe, despite the United States. One of the major issues for Europe right now is maritime security. A huge issue. We know that the Russians have been messing around for years, and it has escalated because of the invasion of Ukraine, the cutting of cables, the threats with their surveillance at sea, even the possibility of a confrontation. Now, nuclear submarines, of course, are part of a broader strategic positioning going back to the Cold War. But the idea that you're boosting your maritime security if you're the UK and your naval forces fits in with what Europe wants as well. And so I would actually say, look, Keir Starmer's message is not just to the United States. It's actually a message to Germany, for example, and it's a message to NATO. After Donald Trump's gone, I think NATO will still exist. So you need to have that planning when you have adults in the room who are there, rather than the orange guy back in the White House.
And so the origins around the Aukus pact, a lot of that was to do with China and countering China there as well. And it's interesting to hear Elbridge Colby, who's going to be leading up the review. He's seen as quite an influential figure here. He said that it's crazy for the US to shrink its submarine fleet given the risk of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, which he says could be around later this decade or early in the 2030s. What do you make of that balance there?
You know what? You can walk and chew gum at the same time. You can provide support for Australia to get submarines, and you can have your own. Indeed, if you're talking about regional security, including regional security in the Asia-Pacific area, which includes China, why aren't you doing both, right? Why are you like, oh, we're going to face China on our own with our submarines, and Australia be damned? That's what's really so weird about the timing of this. It's weird in part because, like I say, it doesn't make sense as part of a multilateral approach to China. And let me illustrate that further. I was given a big chatting with some officials, with some Irish officials earlier this week, and we were talking about what the U.S. was doing. And I said, when's the last time that there was a meeting of the Quad? Now, this is Australia. This is the U.S., this is Japan, this is India. Now, for going on now 20 years, this has been a developing part of America's global position, that you have this regional partnership in Asia. And these officials said, oh, wait, we just checked. Although they have not met since January 21st, the day since after Trump came into office, there's a meeting of the Quad foreign ministers coming up soon. And then there's going to be a summit of the Quad later this year, which will be at the leader level, which would include Donald Trump, right? So if you believe in the Quad, if you believe in that idea of across Asia and Pacific with India and Australia and Japan, and you could bring in other countries that are related to this, like South Korea, why are you threatening to rip up an agreement with Australia? Why? And it comes back to a wider point. There's a tension in the Trump administration between the regional and the global, and simply a Trump protectionist policy. And the Trump protectionist policy is, we protect our president. Everyone else be damned, right? And where it causes tension is that Trump officials do not like to work multilaterally. They just don't like it. They have not liked it with NATO. They certainly don't like it on economic approaches. Look what they're doing with the tariffs. So we deal with countries on a one-on-one basis. Now, whether that means they're going to say, push the UK to the side and deal with Australia directly, we'll see. Right now, I'm still expressing a bit of caution because this could just be Mr. Colby. I would find it hard to think that American military planners who worked for years on this pact would be none too thrilled with this Trumpist guy deciding, well, you did it after years. I'm going to take it apart in a few days.
And I wonder how much of this is sort of a NATO 2.0 with Trump's language in the past saying about how NATO allies need to boost their defense spending, otherwise the US won't come and defend those that don't up their spending, things like that. How much do you think this plays into this? It's more a worded threat rather than a action that's going to happen.
I mean, I think that's a great point. I think this is the Trump MO, the Trump inner circle, which is rather than proceed with multilateral cooperation, you issue threats. And then when countries do respond, and Europe did need to respond to increase its defense spending, then the Trump folks try to take all the credit for it, right? And so, but why it doesn't make sense to me here is the UK's already made the commitment to increase its defense spending. So why are you going after the UK? And why are you going after Australia? Why are you going after Australia, which has stepped up its own defense spending, which has actually been quite supportive, including during Trump 1.0, right? Of, being very much building up security against China. Why are you doing this? It's getting beyond a point of being able to function as an analyst here, because these guys simply don't play by the rules of the game. And again, we don't know for sure it's Eldridge Colby, so we don't know who this official is. But all I can tell you is that the Trump folks break the rules of the game, which is when you deal with allies, you do not deal with allies consistently by bullying and threats. At some point, you have to have a relationship where you're working together. That's just not part of Donald Trump's playbook. And I'm afraid that there are those around him who have a little bit more knowledge than Donald Trump, who also function the same way.
I want to turn to this deal that we have between the US and China. Trump, he declared that there was this done deal between the US and China over raw material exports. Trump wrote on Truth Social that both countries were working closely together to open up China to American trade. And he said that this would be a great win for both countries. What do you make of this? I'm
talking to some folks in the finance and business community in Dublin. Just after we finish talking, I'm heading off. And one thing that they're going to want to know is what is this big? Is this a UK-China trade deal? Is this an end to the potential of the tariff war? Could it lead to an expansion of US-Chinese trade? And so I did what you have to do as an analyst now, which is cross-check what the Trump folks are saying. And I went to China's English language media today. There's two major outlets. There's the Global Times. There's China Daily that I tend to go to. Now, the Global Times doesn't even say anything about this trade deal, but China Daily does. And it's a very lengthy article, and it's a really interesting one. Just as the context for this, the reason why we've had this flutter is that Chinese and American officials met for 2 days on Monday and Tuesday in London, of all places, to try to defuse the tariff war, to see if they could reach some type of accord. What China Daily says is that there has been progress on a framework. Now, they are saying we would welcome cooperation, but they're saying at the same time, but we note that the Trump administration has also been destabilizing. So they are saying, okay, we think the talks are a step forward after what we've gone through, but they're not calling this a deal. And specifically, what Trump is saying is, we've made an agreement where China's going to give us its rare earth minerals and the U.S. is going to reduce the tariffs. That's not what the Chinese are saying. What the Chinese are saying here is that they're happy to discuss the export of rare earth minerals to the United States, but they are not doing this just simply as a giveaway for a reduction in tariffs alone. So no, I mean, Trump has done this consistently. You might remember that supposedly that they were presenting it as a trade deal between the U.S. and the UK. No, it's not. It was actually a memorandum of understanding that they would discuss certain issues, which means they are continuing talks. Trump has actually declared how many trade deals was he going to have? About like a gazillion or something, 75 trade deals like in 75 days. No, you're not going to get that. The number of trade deals that you've had since the Liberation Day threat on April the 2nd, the United States stands at exactly 0. They have had talks with South Korea, for example. They've had talks with the Japanese. Now, it's everybody's interest to say we're talking to the Americans, we're playing nice with them. But no, this rule of thumb here, Trump says something, go to the press from the countries involved and see if they're actually supporting what he says. And I'd say in about 95% of the cases, no.
I want to turn to LA. There's a curfew that's now been imposed by the mayor. Last night it was reported that Trump had enlisted another 700 Marines to undergo training near LA. They're expected to be deployed in the city soon. It looks like Trump is doubling down on his efforts here in spite of local objections to Marines being there.
This is both the combination of striking a pose and a serious threat. And I need to work through this. The striking a pose is Trump sends in the federal troops and they solve everything in Los Angeles. And meanwhile, the Trump administration succeeds in its key goal, which is disappearing thousands of migrants, not just detaining, disappearing them. Just a quick reminder before we talk about striking a pose. This all started last week because the Trump administration is ramping up the seizures of migrants and asylum seekers without due process of law, without hearings, often picking up these people in places where they work, often picking them up while they're with their families, and not necessarily checking their status. There are many legal migrants who have been swept up in this. And we don't know how many legal or illegal migrants because we don't know their names. That's the key. Now, people in Los Angeles said, you know what? We don't really like them lifting these people without due process of law, not notifying the families in many cases, not allowing them access to lawyers, keeping them in inhumane conditions in some circumstances, and then shipping them out of the country, sometimes in the dark of night, and we don't know where they're going. So they gather. On Saturday night, I need to emphasize this because there's so much media spin on this. The number of people who assaulted police officers and were arrested in Los Angeles, in that downtown area, were 2. 1, 2. I'm going to repeat it, 1, 2. Trump was already saying we're sending in the National Guard, federalizing the National Guard, although he does not have legal authority to do so. Why does he not have legal authority to do so? Because under Title 10 of the legislation overseeing the National Guard, there has to be a rebellion or a state that's defying federal authority. One of those two conditions. They didn't exist. Now, that's not going to stop Trump. It's not going to stop Trump because they want to keep disappearing the immigrants and they want to militarize this. So they send in the Marines on Monday, 700 Marines. The Marines still aren't there. All right? Who is actually dealing with the protest in Los Angeles? It as it should have been from the start, Los Angeles law enforcement. That is the message that has gone out from the mayor of Los Angeles, Karen Bass, from the governor of California, Gavin Newsome, almost every state and U.S. representative from California, and from others, including activists. But what's going to happen here is Trump's going to play this for the win, that when the Los Angeles authorities deal with the protest, and if the protests diminish, he's going to say, my military won. Indeed, he's already said that. Before a Marine has stepped foot in Los Angeles, he has said, I saved Los Angeles from burning down. That's the pose. What's the more serious issue here? Beyond the serious issue that Stephen Miller, Donald Trump's key advisor, wants to detain, and then deport 3,000 migrants or asylum seekers per day. That's his target, 3,000 per day. They're up to about 2,000, by the way. Beyond that, and the fact that, again, there's no legal basis for this because these people are not getting hearings in due process of law. This is an authoritarian regime. What do? We don't recognize that the courts can stop us. Courts can issue as many orders as they want about migrants who've been swept up. We're not adhering. We don't recognize that a legislature can stop us, right? We're just going to do this. We don't recognize that the U.S. Constitution can stop us. And we don't recognize that any state government can stop us, because this will not happen just in Los Angeles. There's a case which isn't exactly the same, but there's a Trump ally, Greg Abbott, who's called out the National Guard in Texas, even though the San Antonio mayor said, we don't need the National Guard here. We're dealing with it ourselves. Trump could do this in any city, in any state. And it's the basis for what they failed to do in Trump 1.0, because I will, for sake of time, leave you with a couple of stories. In 2020, during Black Lives Matter, Trump wanted to do this. Trump wanted to do this, for example, in Portland. He wanted to do it in Seattle. He wanted to do it in Kansas City. He wanted to do it in Minneapolis. They did put unmarked units into those cities. They did skate very carefully towards taking this. But at the end of the day, it was state governors, such as in Minnesota, who oversaw calling out the National Guard. So they didn't override the states at that point. But on January 6, 2021, when did Donald Trump not call out the National Guard? Despite legislators asking him, begging him to call out the National Guard, despite some of his own advisors asking him not to call out the National Guard, as his supporters were attacking the U.S. Capitol in what was an attempt at insurrection, people who would later be pardoned for that, Donald Trump did not call out the National Guard. Indeed, what did Donald Trump do? He asked the military on January 6, 2021, to come out in support of him as he tried to block the confirmation of Joe Biden as the 46th U.S. president. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, refused to do so, which is one of the reasons why Trump calls Mark Milley a traitor. Donald Trump is seeking to use migrants, asylum seekers, and refugees as the catalyst for his attempt to expand his use of the military in support of what is not a defense of the nation, but of authoritarian power.
In defense of the Trump administration, in terms of why they claim that they can deploy the Marines, they're saying that they're doing this because local authorities were failing to ensure the safety of law enforcement officials and federal property. That's what they're claiming. We have seen footage of cars being set on fire, looting, vandalism as well. We can't ignore that too. I mean, I'm interested in especially the figures and the statistics here of these arrests that have been made. We don't have any up-to-date figures for the total number of immigration detentions since January the 20th. It's hard to paint an accurate picture of what's really going on there. I mean, there's one estimate that there's around 51,000 individuals in ICE detention facilities as of the 1st of June. 44% of them had no criminal record aside from entering the US without permission. That's one estimate that we're hearing here, but it's hard to gauge a true picture about what's going on here, especially when it was Trump's campaign message to enact the greatest deportation of criminal immigrants, is what he said when he was campaigning. I mean, what do you make of this? How can we draw an accurate figure here?
On Saturday night, the number of people who were arrested for trying to assault Los Angeles police officers, one with Molotov cocktails, one by driving a motorcycle towards them, were 2. That was it, 2. We am now speaking to you on a Thursday. The number of cases of people who have been arrested for assault on police officers in Los Angeles are less than the number of fingers on my 2 hands. Now, there may be more. There may be more because they're going over footage. And you don't want to minimize the fact that, yes, there was a small group amongst large protests that were causing trouble. And there were cars that were burned and there was looting. But that was precisely why Karen Bass, the mayor, and the police force came out on Tuesday night, put out the curfew in a small area of Los Angeles, and that curfew was in existence last night. They are handling the situation. There is no defense of violence that I would make personally, even when you're protesting in a good cause. But the overwhelming majority of the protesters have been peaceful, and they have been protesting what is in effect state violence against people who may or may not be legal migrants, but who have rights. So let's get to those numbers that you talk about, which you talk about. Because this is so rapid now and the number of people that are swept up, it's hard to do so. But let me give you one case that points to what happened. You may remember that almost 300 people were disappeared into the El Salvador Supermax facility. The most famous case is Kilmar Abrego Garcia, the El Salvador citizen who was working in Maryland. Now, he finally has been brought back to the United States, although the Trump administration wanted to throw him in prison, despite the fact they mistakenly deported him. Here's the bigger story that a lot of people didn't get out of all that. It was very hard for a long time to get the names of the people that they disappeared down there. But there have been U.S. journalists that have been working on this. At least 130 people who were disappeared in that El Salvador facility, Venezuelans, and they have gotten the names, they have tracked their records, did not have criminal records. Right? In the vast majority of cases of people who have been detained, they do not have records that we can establish who they are. They don't have records of serious crimes.
I want to turn to Gavin Newsome. He sort of appeared as sort of a future leader of the Democrats from what's been happening here. He's been considered a rising star of the party for a while now. But do you think this is a breakout moment for him as a potential leader for the Democratic Party?
Don't be talking about future leaders of the Democratic Party. Why shouldn't you be doing that? There's an immediate context and a wider context. Look, the salient point here is we've got really, really serious issues that we're talking about. We're talking about those issues of migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers. And by the way, Joe, just a quick reminder, why do I speak out? I was an immigrant for almost 40 years. in the United Kingdom. Nobody knocked on my door. Nobody came in and stigmatized me. Nobody slammed me in the press. People slammed me for other reasons, but not because I was an immigrant. We did it. So the fact that it's happening to people, on a day-to-day basis in the States, the use of the military to try to promote a man who, by the way, on his 79th birthday on Saturday in Washington is going to have a big old military parade to celebrate it. The advisors like Stephen Miller, who effectively believe in a white America, a white nationalist America, who actually hate all immigrants, whether or not they're legal. Let's just put it on the table. These are serious issues. And so to make it into a personality contest between Gavin Newsome and Donald Trump, that's just going to get into a social media fight, and I don't want to go that path. But there's a wider issue here, which is, look, the Democrats are still trying to recover from losing the presidential election, which opened the door to all this nightmare that we've got now. And they have to review it. They lost it because of the economy, because of immigration, but not because of the facts on economy and immigration. They lost it because of the myths, the perception of immigration. Quick reminder, the number of immigrants across the U.S.-Mexico border crossings went down 75% between January 24 and January 25 when someone else was president. And guess what? That someone else who was president and his administration, they didn't go around breaking the law, disappearing people, and invoking the military. So, there's this question of where the Democrats go next. They need to get their message across on immigration. They need to get their message across on the economy, but they need to do it from the ground up. They need to do it in local and state legislatures. They need to do it at the level of governors. They need to do it in Washington at the level of Congress.
Scott Lucas, thank you for joining me on the Trump Report today.
Thank you so much, Joe.